All right, you guys, we are live in the Facebook group and live on the podcast with my friends Starbond and Rubyhead. I am super excited to have them on. They are the co-creators of a group called Lifecamp. And what I love about them is that they talk about shit that really matters. Talking about healing trauma, rewiring your brain and your biology, which I think is so cool and I can't wait to get into. And then living with confidence, clarity, and purpose. And I feel like everybody already is just like, all right, wait, let me stop what I'm doing and let me hear what this is all about. And I think what I found to be so interesting about your backgrounds is that we are talking about the same things. And I think trauma gets a bad rap. And that's why I named this episode Your Trauma from Your Mama, because I don't think people really understand trauma. And Ruby, you said something so profound right before we got started, which when I had asked your intentions for today's podcast, and you said, I want to give, we want to have people walk away from this episode feeling as though there's hope. And then you went on to say, and that they're not fucked up because they have trauma. So can we start there? Like, let's start there. Like, why? Okay, I think we all think we're fucked up because we have trauma. But can we first define trauma, Ruby, and then also share why you said that? Like, why aren't we fucked up as a result of that?
Absolutely. Well, let's just simplify the whole topic with trauma being something that overwhelms the body's experience, right? So I'm incapable of navigating this experience. So what's interesting about trauma is it's going to affect the body in almost exactly the same way, whether it's an all caps trauma like big abuse, or it's a chronic stress from really critical parents, or, it can look so many different ways, but ultimately our body responds the same way to trauma. And so that's why people can think like, oh, well, I just had a challenging, like maybe my parents were just kind of mean, or they didn't, I was a latchkey kid, right? And so they might not think I have all this big trauma. I don't have anything big that I have to navigate. But the reality is it really affects our bodies in the same way. So it doesn't help to judge our trauma like mine's not big enough, or mine's too small, or mine doesn't matter. Yes. And that's an important piece there, because guess what? Like your physiology outside of the mind, like the way your body navigates it and your brain navigates it, is really the same. And that's ultimately why when we do the work to heal the physiology inside of ourselves, what Star and I call the biological landscape, then we can really have that integration and healing of our trauma. And it doesn't mean you have to be fucked up. It doesn't, like, whatever happens doesn't mean it gets to carry on and become the rest of your life. It doesn't get to define you or be who you are. Like, it's something that happens, and maybe there's something to grab and learn from that, and maybe not, but there's definitely a possibility to heal and nurture and then like live your life at the fullest, like what that really means to you.
That's so encouraging, because I think so many times people measure their own trauma based on other people's trauma. I remember when I was raped and I told a woman that I was, and she had been as well. She was like, oh, but mine happened in 2015 and yours happened in 2018. Like, she started judging it. And in that moment, I felt such compassion, because she was like, well, yours is so much more new, and then I've also heard clients say, oh, but the way I grew up is so much different than the way that my peer here in this group has grown up. And so mine shouldn't be that bad, but I do still feel pretty fucked up. And so, Star, I wanted to ask you a question. Ruby started talking about the biology, and immediately my mind was like, how do you do that? Like, how do you not define that one trauma is bigger than the other, whether it's comparing within your own life or that of even maybe your siblings or something like that? Sure. But can you walk us through, like, what does the biology of trauma mean? And I know that's such a vague question, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about.
And I can sum it up pretty quickly. And, part of what Ruby's touching on is that also there is a spectrum of trauma. Do you know what I mean? Like, most people think of like the most dramatic crisis ever, like terrorism, sexual assault, things like that, etc. But part of trauma, first of all, what we need to start doing is really normalizing it in our culture, because everybody is impacted on some level, whether it's a micro scale or a macro scale. There's also a big conversation that often gets left out around trauma that I have to bring up, which is the stigmatization around trauma when it comes to certain groups, such as, like, for example, growing up, with racism, growing up, with homophobia, growing up in poverty, right? And so being subjected to that level of social oppression day in and day out causes not only chronic stress, right? Which is like, an influx of cortisol regularly running through your system, which is also referred to as like chronic or toxic stress. But the internalization of constantly being in an oppressed state, right, is a really, really big factor when we talk about trauma. And it's completely relative. So whether you're a sexual assault victim or you're somebody who's been, dealing with homophobia your entire life, like both matter, even if the experiences are different. So the thing that you need to take away in terms of when we talk about biology and physiology, it doesn't matter your story. You could have grown up in foster care. You could have experienced racism. You could have, been kidnapped, God forbid, whatever the case may be. What we know about trauma is this: big or small, chronic or acute, is that it lands in the body the same way across the board. It's non-discriminatory. So regardless, so regardless of who you are, what socioeconomic background, what race you are, what gender, it affects the body the same way. And one of the most salient ways that it affects, when you ask about the physiology and the biology, is that people who have an experience of trauma or a history of trauma tend to have, if not all the time, an overactive fight or flight response, right? And so that's like the most salient feature, meaning that you're literally in overdrive all the time, pedal to the metal from the moment you wake up to when you go to sleep. And what you see, and there's a spectrum of symptoms, but one of the most, common features of this is like chronic anxiety. There's also impact to the prefrontal cortex with trauma, which causes feelings of low self-esteem and insecurity, because that's the part of the brain that helps you navigate life and reflect on life and your self-perception. So it's really a combination of like having parts of the brain be impacted, similar to a traumatic brain injury. And then over the course of a lifetime, symptoms start to reveal themselves in a variety of different ways. And what we see in the mental health world is that oftentimes people get diagnosed, misdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, and trauma gets neglected completely, when trauma is really mimicking the physiological symptoms of so many different mood disorders.
Oh my God. Okay. I could take this conversation 7 different ways, and I know we only have a little bit of time. So a couple of things that jump out. I did not realize that trauma, whether it's big or small, like you said, a kidnapping or a car accident. I mean, literally, like even if it was a fender bender, right? Or getting like that, those traumas are stored in the body similarly, but it makes so much more sense because I remember when I was raped, I then remember that the symptoms of hypervigilance, not sleeping, eating too much, not eating enough, I was like, oh wait, this is very similar to growing up with my mom, who was an alcoholic, and my dad, who was avoided.
Yeah.
So this makes so much sense because I had done enough inner work through 12-step and understood like, oh, I need to get help, because if I don't get help from this is going to progress. So I want to go back to something you said around the symptoms. I know I started to share some of the physiological symptoms, but what are some other symptoms that you all have seen in your own, either your own experience with clients or your own experience in your own life? How can we start to recognize trauma? And I think I'm going to go say a bold statement here. We've all experienced trauma. Yeah. Okay. How can we recognize it within ourselves? Because I'm actively in fight or flight almost every week. I have to go back to the doctor, and she's like, she flips a switch and I'm back in to the parasympathetic, but I don't even recognize when I'm in it. So what are some of the symptoms that you guys have noticed?
Sure. Well, I could say that there's definitely a spectrum, and then I'll let Ruby respond in terms of her personal and her work as well. There's a spectrum. There's going to be, some things that are really obvious. Like we've got, like you said, the hypervigilance, the anxiety, the, disrupted sleep patterns, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, things along the lines. Those are like those really stereotypical standards of like either developing PTSD or PTSD, right? And that's like on one end of the spectrum. And then we have like other things that every highly functional person that I've ever, come in contact with in my office that I didn't realize it was trauma shows up like this. It's much more elusive. It could be, again, low self-esteem. It could be indecisive, like chronic indecisiveness, a lack of clarity, procrastination, avoidant behaviors, fear of intimacy, promiscuity on the flip side. Like, there's all different ways. Again, there is oftentimes a spectrum. So although it can affect everyone, it does affect people differently. And just like you said, in terms of your incident, I've had a lot of adversity in my life. And interestingly enough, the one that affected me the most was like a bicycle accident when I fell and, you know, hurt myself. Like out of all the horrible fucked up things I've ever been through, that's the one that I feel like has the most visceral response in my body comparatively. So it's interesting how trauma, you know, kind of gets internalized. Ruby, do you want to add?
Yeah, 100%. I love this conversation. And when we talk about things like, there's a lot of great buzzwords right now, like imposter syndrome and feeling like a fraud, like trauma. Are you hyper successful and you never take a break? Or when you take a break, you feel guilty or like you need to keep moving? Trauma. You know, one of the ways that it really showed up in my life was in just hitting these roadblocks in my relationship where it was like, are we really in the same fucking fight 15 years later, right? Or 10 years later. And it's where it's like you can only get so far. The feeling of I can only get so far and then the shoe's going to drop, right? Or like things can only get so good and then something bad is going to happen. Those pieces. And that appears like across the board in life. You know, for me, it was like in all the things. I even had this thing where it was like, I can't talk about my relationship being good because then I know something bad is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That impending doom, I think, is really a highlight for so many people. And again, it shows up differently, but just like the what if conversation, like, well, what if this happens? What if this goes down? It's like that anxiety of it couldn't possibly work out well because of that unanticipated fear, you know?
Which in relationships, I just want to, this one extra piece, within relationships, part of what that does is we start sabotaging our relationships before they even have an opportunity to get good, right? We're already planning for failure. So it's like, let me fuck this up ahead of time. And it's not like I'm thinking that. People don't think, you don't like write it in your journal, gonna fuck this up ahead of time. I mean, maybe you do, but most of us, I don't think do, right? It's this subconscious patterning at work.
You guys just touched on something that was something that I wish somebody told me 11 years ago when I started 12-step recovery, because it just exactly what you all are describing, the symptoms, the thoughts I was thinking, the feelings I was feeling. I was on the brink of suicide. I was like, I cannot figure out, I keep chasing one relationship after another because I think it's going to make me feel better. I wind up with the same kind of guy. He just looks a little bit different, or maybe he's incredible, but I self-sabotage it. And yet I still feel like shit. And I wish that somebody said this to me, which is summarizing what you guys said, is that we have all had experiences where we feel all these symptoms that you're describing. And yet we never knew what the root cause was. And so I always say that, like, okay, whether you're being promiscuous or whether you're still wanting to reach out to your ex, or you're eating too much or not enough for a lot of the things we just described, if you go one level deeper, you've got to be able to acknowledge that something happened, or maybe many of things happen that caused you to not trust or to not feel good enough, or that, like you said, there's the biology that's hardwired. So I know that our audiences are very similar, and specifically for this audience, they're going to want to go to the how. I mean, I'm like, because you're talking to me and I'm exactly who you just described. I'm like rearing to ask you, so how do you, not, this is a bad word, but how do you fix this? Like, I know we don't need to be fixed and we're not fucked up, but I think many of us are like, can we remove this shit? Because like, I'd really like to get on with my life. I'd love to hear from each one of you on that. Like, what are the simple things that we can do to just get started? I know there's so many things like in the future, but if somebody's at the point right now where they can identify what we've said, what would be like a couple of recommendations? And you can totally plug your program.
I'll touch on the idea, like in terms of what's the like immediate aha around this, is that in a nutshell, like really understanding your emotional blueprint. And this is what Ruby and I dive super deep into in our program, Lifecamp. But ultimately what the emotional blueprint is, and I'm going to just kind of sum it up in a nutshell and blow your mind for a second, but this is how intimacy works, and this is how trauma relates to intimacy. And it relates back to your title of the program, right? Like trauma from your mama type vibe. So the fact of the matter is that by and large across the globe, right, children are being raised by women. We know that that's not a broad, we know that's a broad statement, and we know that that doesn't encapsulate every single person, but by and large, we know this as a global society. Women have been in charge of rearing children. We also know that women are considered second-class citizens, you know, on a global level. So when we start to take that into account, we have to look at the social and cultural infrastructures that play a role into how women feel about themselves. Women, by and large, are bred right? To be insecure, to be codependent, to be needy, right? And to ultimately rely on external forces, dominant forces for their well-being. So it puts us in a chronic vulnerable state on a macro level. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is it's important to understand that when we look at intimacy. So now you have women, right, by and large, considered who are bred in these sort of dysfunctional ways, who tend to have low self-esteem, a lack of self-worth and deserving, right? Insecurity, are now raising the children. Okay. And we know that women by and large are disproportionately also affected, or those who identify as women are disproportionately affected by trauma. And they're in charge of raising the children. So now we have traumatized people, traumatized humans, rearing children, right? Passing all their trauma down to their children. And now it looks like this, the emotional blueprint, which is whoever you were raised by, mom, dad, foster care, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, doesn't matter, right? Those couple of primary influences in your life, typically it's mom, becomes your emotional blueprint. So whatever dynamic that you had in those early years sets the energetic signature for how you give, receive, and understand connection and intimacy moving forward. So whatever you kind of played out in those earlier years ultimately sets the tone for what you understand for relationships. So what you do is you will take what you can get out of your relationships in those early years because you need it as a survival mechanism. So even if mom is a critical, abusive bitch 80% of the time, but 20% of the time she's really loving and funny and compassionate, you'll hang on to that relationship because you need that 20% for survival, right? So fast forward this now, 20 years later, okay, you move into adult intimacy. What we do on a subconscious level is we will go into our adult intimacy and we will, on a neurobiological level and on a subconscious event, we will seek out relationships that mimic these early energetic signature, the early dynamics. And the reason why we do it is not just because it's familiar, that's the obvious answer, but we do it because subconsciously we are attempting to heal our early childhood wounds. So if I have a person who is emotionally unavailable, if I have a person that's energetically inconsistent, if I have a person that's judgmental because emotionally that's what I grew up with, energetically that I grew up with, if I can get this person to be more stable, if I can get this person to be more present, whatever the need is, then we think on a subconscious level, it's going to heal our shit from 20, 30 years ago. And this is why, this is like the aha moment. This is why so many people keep attracting a type when intellectually they know better. This also feeds into, like you said, codependency. And it also feeds into this idea of, why do I lose myself in this relationship? Or why do I have the high highs and the low lows? Because that person serves as a pawn for these early childhood dynamics. So I know that was a big explanation, but
no, it was right on. It was right on. And I just want to say this piece before I kick it over to Ruby. It's like, you guys go back and just pause the podcast right now and go back and rewind and listen to Star and then do it one more time, because what she just said changed my entire life when I learned it. I had somebody who mentored me through that process that Star just described, and literally it changed the trajectory of how I chose to date and who I was going to be friends with and what family members I associate with. And it wasn't easy. I still tried to go in for that 20%, even just recently with some friends, and realized, ooh, the stove's hot, still getting burnt. What the fuck am I doing? I'm not doing this anymore. And instead of confronting it or having a big disagreement about it, I just walked away and said, I'm already doing my part. I'm already healing and taking care of myself. I knew for myself, I didn't have to go any deeper and try to get them to go, give me more than 20%, because that's all they can give. Right? So powerful. So again, if you guys are listening to this, pause the recording right now, go back, listen to Star say that, and then do it again, because it's life-changing. And I have another question, but Ruby, I wanted to see what you also had to share about that too.
Absolutely. I mean, this work really is game changing. The first thing I want to do with everyone listening and with us here right now is do an exercise, because part of where you're like, well, how can you heal this now? Well, here's how. So, and it's really simple. It's called breathing. So I just want you to not stare at the screen, but just kind of look out at the horizon, and we're going to inhale through the nose for the count of 4. So inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we're going to slowly exhale through the nose for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Inhale deeply through the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause and slowly exhale for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And one more deep inhale through the nose for 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause for a second at the top and slowly exhale for 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Dropping you back into your body, helping the brain say it's safe to be here right now. It's safe to learn this information, right? We can do this. So there are really simple ways to start to navigate your biology. And the piece I want to touch in on here that's so important is that we think all of those things we listed, feeling like an imposter and chronic low self-esteem and things like that, we often think those are the cost of doing business, right? Well, this is just what it means to be alive. You have to work hard, you have to this, like there's suffering, there's all that. And that's not really true, right? It's like we just haven't realized that there are deeper things going on here that have affected us, right? It's like Star said, like the trauma happens, your brain is impacted, and then it shows up later in all these different ways, right? And so what we think of as the cost of doing business is really trauma showing up in your life. And when you do the work to heal the trauma, the cost of doing business goes away. Like, is life still challenging? Sure. But you have emotional resiliency to navigate it. You have the ability to stay more present in your body. You have the ability to not hit default and do those old behaviors. And the reason the healing is so important is so many things out there are like a band-aid, right? You go to yoga class and you kind of feel better, but then you get home and like you trip and like, boom, it's back to like that fight or flight response. Or maybe you get some therapy and you're good while you're at therapy, but like 3 days later, like shit hits the fan and you're back to square one. And so it's like you keep doing these things that feels like a band-aid, like reading all the self-help books, doing all of the things, right? But your baseline, your default is still that same uncomfortable place. And so one of the things that we teach in Life Camp and that I want to share with you all is what we call the biological landscape. And that's made up of like your physiology, your brain, your nervous system, all of the parts. Like think of like if we took off our skin, all of that. And the thing about your biological landscape is it gets disrupted. So trauma disrupts how our brain is and how our nervous system reacts in the world. And so when we repair at the level of the brain and the nervous system, we stop putting a band-aid on the challenges in our life. We stop putting a band-aid on how we react, and we really get to the root cause. And it does not mean ever that you have to go back and shine a fucking flashlight on the horrible shit that happened to you. It doesn't mean you have to rehash and dig through and pull apart your trauma, right? It really can look like in the now, the tools that we use to repair the nervous system and the brain so that we can heal and integrate that trauma. And ultimately, what we really want people to be able to do is like, get the gift from your trauma and now live like a motherfucking badass. Because you've owned it and you've integrated it and it doesn't own you anymore.
So well said. The one other question I wanted to ask that was coming up when Star had been talking was about, you mentioned the word emotionally unavailable people. And one of the most common questions I get from people who have gone through the process of let love in and they've now decided like, oh, I'm gonna start dating again, but oh shit, am I gonna like fuck this up? Am I gonna attract emotionally unavailable people? And this is the question they ask: how will I know that I've attracted emotionally available people? And how do I continue to do that so that I can use my voice? So I thought that might be, in the context of trauma, in the context of what you had shared with us, that this would be a nice question to end with. And then I'd love for you all to tell us a little bit more about Life Camp and when the next program is open for enrollment, because I truly believe in the work that you two are doing. And I believe that it's making a massive impact on people and you're making it fun. Like if you guys don't follow them on Instagram, please do, because the Instagrams are hilarious and just making it really relatable that I think we all realize, and this is my hope for this conversation, is that we're not alone. We've all been through some sort of trauma, big or small, and that we can heal from it and get out of the fight or flight. I know I'm in it, like I said, constantly. So let me pause there and just hear from each one of you about how do you break the bond of trauma so that you can attract emotionally available people?
Yeah. So you're probably not going to like this answer, and maybe the listeners won't either. So
I don't care what they think. Like, I want you to be honest, because sometimes we get resistance because there's truth to what you're saying.
Yeah. So the truth of the matter is that whether we want to acknowledge it or not, like, we're always attracting our match. So even when you're dating assholes, right? Or even when you're dating somebody abusive, which I've done both, right? Like, yes, I could give you a laundry list of reasons why those people suck, and why they were harmful and why I was a victim. But the truth of the matter, and this is like that really, really edgy conversation around empowerment. Everybody wants to throw that word around, but nobody really wants to dive into it.
Mm-hmm.
But empowerment really gets cultivated through accountability. So the truth of the matter is, when I don't feel good about myself, when I am subscribing to my trauma, unconsciously, when I am responding from it, the truth of the matter is that I am chronically in a victimized state. So I'm going to consistently attract individuals to validate that. So in sum, like, if you want to start attracting emotionally available people, present people, successful people, whatever it is, the first thing is that you can't attract anything that you're not providing for yourself. So are you emotionally available for yourself? Are you present with yourself? Are you accountable for the way that you're co-creating your reality? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that if you want to alter anything in your life, I don't give a shit if it's a relationship, if it's money, you know what I mean? If it's, personal success, you have to change your belief system. So whatever you believe about yourself and the subject at hand determines what you get to create out of that. So most people, similar to you, I have clients who come in and they want their queen, you know what I mean? Or they want their king, or they want this like deep, passionate relationship, but they believe that all men cheat, or they believe that they're not good enough. So like, the truth of the matter is, you can't have competing beliefs right now. You can't be the chick that like gets up in the morning and hates herself and has a shit ton of negative self-talk and doesn't feel deserving or good enough. And somehow you think you're going to go to the grocery store and find your king up here. Kings don't hang out with chicks like that. Like, I just want to be honest with you. And vice versa. Do you know what I mean? That really baller woman who feels confident and alive in the world and vibrant and, resourceful doesn't hang out with the dude who's petty and, controlling and jealous and possessive. Like, those two don't hang out together. So it's about doing that internal work, and wherever you're at, like, every relationship that you have, and this is that hard pill to swallow, and I've had to swallow it multiple times. Every relationship I've had has simply been a reflection of the relationship between me and me. Nobody wants to own that, because it's much easier to blame other people, and it helps when you're in a breakup too. So
it's really honest, and you're right. It is really a mirror reflection of ourselves. Like, and it doesn't matter if you want to be in that wounded energy of blaming and shaming other people, like, that's not going to work. So by the way, you're right on the money. I mean, I teach the same shit. Like, you have to be the person that you want to be. And a friend of mine was texting today saying like, oh, I'm getting bad vibes from this guy because he was very much in his wounded masculine. She is owning her shit and she's feeling incredible. And he's like, oh, it took her 2 hours to text her. It took her 2 hours to text him back. And now he doesn't want to do a sleepover. And he's like, and it's like, bitch, you don't have time for that. Like, bye, see ya. And she's like, and she asked, how do I communicate this gracefully? And I said, one of the ways that you can do that is by simply stating what you need, which is, I no longer want to continue in this relationship. Are you open to hearing why? And let him receive it if he's willing to receive it, And so I think that's really powerful. And again, I think it's something that we need to hear. Ruby, what are your thoughts on this about attracting emotionally available people?
I mean, I could just be like, ditto.
Seriously.
Because it's really, I want to describe LifeCamp just a little bit here.
Please.
Because it's so important. People come in and they're like, we get a lot of people like, okay, yeah, let's work on the relationship, or like this person or that, or like they want to work on these things. And
yeah,
we have 10 modules, and 1 through 4 is you, and then you. Because it is so important to do that healing work first, because it's like, how do I know if I'm attracting emotionally unavailable people? Like, let's do some work. Do we have a competing belief? Like, what are your core beliefs? Mostly when shit's going wrong, what does conversation look like in your head? The one, like, you're obviously not going to say out loud because it's so shitty and horrible. That's going to say a lot about what you're attracting. right? So when you have a bad day, or you, didn't hit the mark with work, or these other things, like when you look at these other places in the world, and then the conversation that goes on inside your head, that's going to say a lot about what kind of people you're attracting and who you're even available to attract and to navigate life with. And so we consistently, in this trajectory of Life Camp, we go back to you and you, right? The most important relationship to attract and be available to emotionally and all the other ways is right here. Because when we can cultivate that relationship, when we can navigate and untangle our core limiting beliefs, like those beliefs like from way back when that are now like pulling all the strings in our relationships, when we can start to dismantle and untangle those and not be living life creating from a default that is this belief that I developed when I was a little kid that I might not be aware I have, right? We got to shine light on them and then reprogram and shift those so that we're not operating out of this place that says, I'm not worthy, I'm not safe, I'm not good enough, or I need to be perfect, or like all these things we think we need to be or do or have in order to receive love and be loved and be worthy. And so that like really ultimately that deep work, like it goes first, like you pave the way with you for the relationship you want to have. You go first, and then that relationship's going to meet you there because that's who you want to, is someone who went first.
I love that, the ability to go first. As we close out, can you both share how people can get in touch with you and also how they can sign up for your program, Life Camp?
Sure. So Ruby and I are both on Instagram. You can come find us there. And we offer all sorts of like fun, freaky, little fun, videos and resources there, free information, awesome content. And again, we want to keep it relatable, and we bring a really weird sense of humor because nobody wants to talk about trauma because it's like, who wants to do that? And so in order for us to normalize it, we like to make it fun and engaging. So you can find us on Instagram, and then also Life Camp. We are doing our next enrollment. It'll be mid-July, second or third week of July. And so you can contact us on Instagram, and you can do a one-on-one info session with myself, and I can get into all the details of what the program is, how it's laid out, and what to expect. And then Ruby, should we add anything else?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Life Camp is our brainchild and passion project. Both Star and I are incredibly passionate about this work, and we have been friends, really close friends, for a long time. We've always wanted to work together, and finally it was like, let's do this thing. And we have incorporated the best practices in our personal work with ourselves and our big healing journeys. Like we both come from really pretty intense abusive backgrounds and really gnarly childhoods, ultimately. And so we have the tools we personally use, and then the tools we use with our clients. So between us, we have like over 30 years collective experience in working with humans, healing and helping them live more fully alive and really powerful lives. And so Life Camp really is the culmination of what we found to be the best practices that actually move the needle and make a difference. So we don't want to like just give people busy work. No one has time for busy work, right? We want to heal, and we want to heal now. So we really say, like, when you do Life Camp and you go all in with us for the 10 weeks, you're going to transform more in those 10 weeks than you will in 5 years of therapy, because we aren't just teaching you tools, we're doing neuroplasticity with you. We're restoring your biological landscape. Like, we're not doing any band-aid work. We're doing the deep work, and it's actually fun. You have a really good time. You learn a hell of a lot of really great shit, and you transform yourself, your relationships, and your life. And so we really move from the self. We have a whole section on self and core beliefs and that work. And then we move into relationships and conflict resolution. And then we move into clarity, purpose, and living your legacy and owning the fuck out of your trauma, because that's what we want. We want to give people tools and hope and the ability to live their ultimate best life. Like, it's going to look different to every single person. What we really want is you to be able to do that, to be you and live you, because I do believe, and we do believe, the world needs people who are lit up from the inside, who've done their personal work and are ready to like just be you. You don't have to give anything. If you're you in a really clear, awesome, unique way, in this healed, passionate place, you really have a lot to offer the world, and it's super beautiful.
It's so incredible, that program that you guys have put together, and I'm so proud of the both of you to be able to shed your light on your past experiences and put a program together that will change so many lives. I know for me, being in a group setting was the number one thing that helped me to feel like I was less alone and to make the biggest change in my life. And who the hell knew that I would start a career based on this stuff? Because at that time, I had I couldn't see the future even just a year out. I didn't really know myself. So you're helping so many people really truly know themselves and have some fun doing it, even though they're uncovering some hard shit. And I'm proud of you guys. This is incredible. So with that being said, I'm going to say thank you so much. Can't wait to share all the love with Life Camp. And thank you both so much for being on.
Thank you, Katie. This was such a privilege and such an honor. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to your audience for
Yeah.
being here, for going for it, for being willing to go a little deep and get edgy with us. We love it.
Absolutely.